Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining our Virtual Agent Academy. As always, feel free to check out our community forum to find the latest tips and advice, content, and Q&A from experts. If you want to catch this recording later, it will be available on YouTube within the week. We do have a YouTube playlist called Virtual Agent Academy, so feel free to check it out. If you like what you're seeing on YouTube, go ahead and click that like and subscribe button below. In terms of announcements, Tokyo GA is tomorrow, September 21st. So tomorrow, be sure to upgrade your instance. We have a lot of cool innovations coming in our Tokyo release. And what you're about to see is just one of them for the virtual agent. So today, we're going to talk about how to dynamically translate languages using virtual agents. So you'll hear a little bit about how we progressed in this technology from even say as far back as the Paris release to now. And with me is our rockstar guest speaker, Roxanne Johnson, and she's going to go over dynamic translation for the virtual agent. Roxanne, over to you.
Hi there, Victor. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you good.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to, as you can see from the agenda, we're going to spend a few minutes discussing the DT for or dynamic translation for virtual agent overview. Then I'll go through a setup demonstration, and then we'll have some Q&A in the end. Next slide. So what is dynamic translation? Dynamic translation for virtual agent really allows end users who speak in one language or having a preferred language have conversations or engage in conversations with virtual agent in the that's published in a different language. So for example, virtual agent can be published in English, and if you have an end user who prefers to engage with virtual agent in Spanish, they can engage in Spanish with minimal effort. And then availability and licensing. So starting in the Tokyo release, dynamic translation for virtual agents available to customers with Pro or Enterprise entitlement. Next slide. So how did we get here? So in Paris, it was a evolution from Paris through Tokyo. So in Paris, we delivered the localization framework, basically static translation of forms and knowledge articles from one language to another. With Quebec, we released dynamic translation for agent chat. And that really detects an end user's language and does real-time translations for that live conversation to the agent's language so that both the end user and the agent will understand each other in their preferred languages. And then in Tokyo, we're releasing dynamic translation for virtual agent, which is very similar to dynamic translation for agent chat, and that it detects an end user's language, does that same real-time translation of the user's entered request or question into VA's preferred language and the language of the topics. So it will translate one language to another, just like it did for dynamic translation for agent chat. Now, what you'll hear in the things to consider for implementation is that it's always a good best practice to align your dynamic translation for agent chat implementation approach with your dynamic translation for virtual agent implementation approach. So we'll touch a little bit on that later in the presentation.
What are some things to consider when evaluating your multi-language strategy for virtual agent? Today, we're going to look at 3 approaches and consider the number of languages covered, the implementation costs, the time to value, extensibility, the end user experience, both with translation and the UI, and finally, which channels are supported with each approach. Now, typically, all 3 are part of an overall strategy, leveraging direct language support for your primary languages and dynamic machine translations for the remaining. Now, with the direct language approach, you can support up to 17 languages. The implementation cost is higher relative to the other 2 approaches because you're performing expert translations of all topics, strings, and keywords, as well as creating, training, and maintaining an NLU model if you're using NLU for your primary languages. This approach typically involves employing an expert linguist, thus the term expert translations. These translations, as you would imagine, take some time, and so the time to value is slightly longer than it would be with the other two approaches. This has a lower extensibility than the other two approaches since only 17 languages are supported today, but it does provide a very positive translation experience for your end users. With the expert translations, there really isn't any reason that there would be any inaccuracies with the translations, and the virtual agent UI is also consistent without any additional configurations with respect to the language that the user is having the conversation with virtual agent chat. And channel support covers all of the channels leveraging this approach. Now, I mentioned that all three are typically part of an implementation strategy for multi-language support for virtual agent. And so when you're looking at languages above those 17 languages that we provide direct language support for, actually up to 22. So it includes those 17 languages that are covered under direct language support plus 5 additional languages. So the language coverage is indicated by the language plugins that ServiceNow provides for you to download. So what you would do here is you would have at least one direct language support model or approach for at least one of your primary languages. You could have more, but if you have at least one, let's say English for this case, if you have English deployed leveraging the direct language support approach, and you want to leverage dynamic machine translation with localization for the remaining languages up to the 22 that are supported by ServiceNow, there would be a slight incremental cost. So we consider this sort of a mid-cost. What you'll be doing is you'll be installing the additional language plugins, and then you will be turning on dynamic machine translation for those languages over and above the primary languages that you've deployed using the direct language approach. So the time to value is fairly short. Again, just the time that it would take to install those plugins and then turn on dynamic machine translation for those additional languages. The extensibility is still somewhat limited in that we support up to 22 languages today. The translation experience, now that you're leveraging dynamic machine translation, which requires you to subscribe to a translation service, third-party translation service, that would vary by the service provider. The UI, however, would be consistent just like it is with direct language support. Those 22 language plugins that we provide allow the UI to be consistent with the language of the conversation. So the hover text, the time agos, which indicate how long it's been since the message has come into the virtual agent chat, will be consistent with the conversation language. Channel support is a little bit less than what it is with the direct language approach, in that dynamic translation for virtual agent is not currently supported for mobile or SMS channels. Now, for any language above those 22 languages that we provide the plugins for, how would you deploy for those? Well, you would leverage dynamic machine translation alone. So third-party service providers support between 54 and 133 languages, depending on the service provider. So moving from the 22nd language through 133 is another incremental cost, however, fairly low. At this point, what you're doing is you're adding that language to the sys language table, and you're turning on dynamic machine translation for those languages. So the time to value is fairly short. Again, very incremental effort required to go from 22 languages up to 133. The extensibility is very high in that, again, you can support up to 133 languages. The translation experience for your end users, again, just like dynamic machine translation with localization, varies based on your service provider. The agent UI can be consistent, just like it is with the other two approaches. However, because we don't have a language plugin, there is a small configuration element required here so that the hover text, the watermarks, and the time agos that we described earlier will be in the conversation language, just like they were with the other two approaches. This, however, can be done via script. So if you automate this configuration with a script, decreases your level of effort, and so your time to value can remain fairly short relative to the other two. Your channel support is the same as it was for the second approach in that DT for VA is not currently supported for mobile or SMS channels.
Okay, this is what's required. Of course, there's some detail going on here behind these boxes, and you'll see that during the exercise. But you basically activate your third-party translation service provider after you've engaged with them and you have a subscription with them. You configure the connections and the credentials for that third-party service provider. You add your languages. That is either done via the ServiceNow localization plugin or manually adding them to the table. You'll see that today as well. You turn on language detection and dynamic machine translation. Dynamic machine translation is turned on by each individual language, so you can pick and choose at that point. And then if you're using NLU, you would configure your NLU model for that, one or a few primary direct language supported languages, or you would leverage keywords and you would enter those keywords. So now I believe we're going to get into the exercise. Okay, so what I'm going to do is show you today those the little flow diagram boxes that you saw on that prior slide. We're going to go through all of those, and then we're going to have a demo in Spanish. So the first thing that you'll do is you'll activate your service provider. So in the search dialog box where you see the DOIN that you're typing there, if you can type translator configurations for me, please. Yep, okay, and if you can click on that. So this is where you activate your service provider. So we have 3 that are configured, and we have 1 being Microsoft. And you can see there Microsoft is active. It's true. If you can open that particular Microsoft entry for me, then we'll see what you see here on the top is you see an active checkbox. So it's as easy as activating that particular configuration. And then you'll mark Microsoft as the default for translation, as well as the default for detection. It's a little bit hard to see now, but both of those are checked. You can see a little white check mark there with a white check mark in the active box as well. Next, you'll configure your service provider. So if you navigate to connection and credentials, I think typing in connections probably will pull it up. Yep, if you click on that for me, the connection and credential aliases. And what you'll see here is 21 different connections. And what we're looking for is the Microsoft translation one. It's about 3/4 of the way down in the list. So if we open that, this is where you identify your connection and your credentials. So this is the communication piece. And you will log into or navigate, if you will, into that connection, the MS CRED. So clicking just to the left, not the API, but the, yes, the name, that would be perfect. So this is where you input your connection URL. And if you're actually, and where you activate it. So you can see there's an active with a checkbox. Yep. So that's where you'll activate it. And then if you were adding this as a new connection, you would additionally have the capability to insert your key. And that key will come from your service provider, and that will be unique to your subscription, and that will allow you to connect to them and will give you access to them. Okay, so next you'll add languages to the ServiceNow language table. And so if you navigate to languages, yeah, so if you click on that, so what you'll see here is we have 26 languages in this table. The 3 at the top are the only 3 that are active. So you'll see in the far right column, you'll see active is true for Spanish, English, and Danish. Now there's 2 ways to get languages into this table. One way is to install the ServiceNow language plugin for a specific language. Those were the 22 localization plugins that I spoke about earlier. The other way is to manually add a language. In the case of Danish, I manually added that language, whereas Spanish was added to this table via the Spanish language plugin. And so if you were to have the capability to click on the new, to add a new row, then you would basically just input Danish, and we can maybe go to Danish to take a look there. So if you open that, it'll look slightly different than if you were adding, but you would add the name, you would add the locale to character ID, which in this case is DA. You would activate it, so there's an active checkbox there, and then you would identify the text direction, left to right or right to left, depending on the language that you are configuring, and then you would simply save it, and that's how you would get the language added if you were adding it manually, if it wasn't supported by a ServiceNow language plugin. Now, adding the languages to this table makes them available for dynamic machine translation. So now I'm going to show you what I meant by that. So if you go to the Conversational Interfaces home and then navigate to Virtual Agent Settings. So go to Settings. Yeah. That's fine as well, Chat Settings. And then you'll click on Virtual Agent. And then you'll scroll down slightly and you'll see a multi-language support card there at the bottom. Now, logging in as an administrator allows you to toggle language detection and dynamic language translation on or off. So you'll see those switches there. Typically, they would be highlighted there with dark green because they're on, and they would be available for you to toggle off and on. Now, if you click View All, that will take you to the table that shows the list of available languages. Now, if you remember, when we looked at the language table, it's actually the SIS language table. I think there was 20 some odd languages available, and 3 of them were active. Any active language in that SIS language table will show up here in this multi-language support for VA table. And then from here, you can additionally turn it on or off for dynamic machine translation. So in this case, you can see that we've turned on dynamic machine translation for Spanish and Danish. So that shows Spanish being the ServiceNow localized plugin supported language, and then Danish being the one that is not covered by the list of 22 that's supported with a plugin. So you can see both of them here. We've activated both of them. Activating them is fairly straightforward. If you click on the true for Spanish, for example, that will take you here. Now, if you click on Edit Record, which is just above in that yellow highlighted area, it will open up the dynamic translation enabled checkbox, and it's as easy as simply checking that off and on if you had administrator access to do so. Okay, and then let's see. Now we will go to NLU. So if you are leveraging NLU, so you'll want to go to Virtual Agent again in the settings, and you'll go to the NLU card. Yeah. And so I already have this turned on. So if you click View Settings, yeah, you'll notice that we're using ServiceNow NLU as the provider. And then you'll also notice, again, you see those 3 active languages in this list. And what I've done here is I have turned on NLU for English only. So that means this translates to, no pun intended with the translate, but this translates to using direct language support or expert translations, if you will, for English. So it's really important to note that I am not using expert translations for Spanish, because we'll be seeing that Spanish demo here in just a minute. So I'm only using it for English. So I have created, trained, and maintained an English NLU model. I'm not going to go into any of the additional NLU configuration support for this specific exercise, but what I am going to do is I'm going to show you a few of the different, one additional configuration step I think I mentioned with respect to using a language that is not supported by a ServiceNow language plugin. So you'll want to navigate to System UI. And then you'll want to click on Messages. It's about halfway down in the list there. Yeah. And so if you can please right click on the 3 dots next to the language column, header, yeah, and group by language. This is the best way or easiest way for me to show you. So what you'll see here is you'll see the three languages, Danish, English, and Spanish. There's a consistent theme. Those are the ones that we have active within our instance. And you'll see that Danish has 18 system UI messages configured. So in order to persist that consistent UI that I mentioned with languages that are not supported by a ServiceNow delivered language plugin, you'll need to manually translate or expert translate, if you will, these 18 system UI messages. This is as simple as going to Google Translate, for example, typing in, are you sure you want to end the current, and then the 3 ellipses that you see in that first row. And then Google Translate will translate to your specific language, and you'll add that message as the translated, expert translated value, and then you'll save. Now, it takes about 30 seconds for me to enter one of these. This can be done via script, so you can do this all up front in some type of document, and then you can use a script to do that configuration for you. So now that we've done all of the setup, we can go into our demo. So let's navigate to the Employee Center homepage for the demo. I'm going to open my chat window. As you can see here, Virtual Agent is initializing in English, which is my organization's primary language. I have expert translations in English, and English is supported with a ServiceNow NLU model, which is what you saw during the setup exercise that we just completed. As an end user, I want to engage in a conversation with Virtual Agent in Spanish. So if you recall, Spanish is not supported by expert translations, but we did turn on dynamic translations for Spanish during the setup exercise. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to type my request in Spanish. And I'm using a question of what do I need to do to return to the office? As you can see here, when I hover over the text, it's in English. So let's submit that. So what's happening here is Virtual Agent, the language detection for Virtual Agent actually, has detected that did not enter a request in English, but I did enter a request in Spanish. So it's detected that I'm typing in Spanish, and it's asking me if I'd like to continue the conversation in Spanish. It asks me both in English and in the detected language, which is Spanish, and my buttons, yes or no, are also in both of those languages. So if I choose yes, what will happen now is that Virtual Agent will refresh, and the entire experience will now be in Spanish. We've added a subheader at the top of the chat window here that communicates to the end user that the conversation is being translated using dynamic machine translation. So one of the things that we have found from our customers that if they are transparent with their users that they're using machine translation, then the users are a little bit more flexible with respect to minimal accuracy challenges during the course of their conversation. As you can see also, the hover text now is in Spanish, and the time ago is in Spanish as well. I've gotten my response in Spanish from Virtual Agent, so it's asking me if I'm planning to return to the office. And I'm going to say yes. And it's going to continue through with translating responses. What's actually happening behind the scenes is that when I type in Spanish, there's a call going out to the translation service, and it's translating the Spanish utterance or request or question that the user has typed into Virtual Agent. It's translating that into the primary language of English, sending that English translated question through NLU prediction. The prediction is returning an English response. That English response is going through the translation service and translating to Spanish, and then Virtual Agent is rendering that response or displaying that response in the chat window here in Spanish. And so now it's asking me if I have my booster dose, and I'm going to say yes. It's going to return a response that says, thank you. You're all set. Please practice social distancing and wear your mask. And thank you for using Virtual Agent Chat. The same flow would work for any other language that you have configured and turned on for dynamic translation. And that ends our demo for today. Thank you very much for joining me.
Great. Thanks so much, Roxanne. Thank you, Samantha, for helping. If you haven't already, fill out the poll. This recording will go up on the Virtual Agent Academy playlist on YouTube, as well as the community forum. So feel free to check it out there. And we'll see you soon. Tokyo GA comes out tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.